So welcome to the Inevitable Podcast. I'm your host, Pedro Soren. I'm the founder of Atman. We're a close community of founders and investors playing long-term games together. Today I have the honor and pleasure of having Dr. Cameron Sepah with me here. And, you know, he's certainly not an ordinary founder. Holds a BA in Cognitive Neuroscience from Harvard and a Ph.D. in Clinical Psychology from UCLA. And is also a clinical professor at UCSF, where he trains psychiatrists to treat patients with ACT, which is evidence-based therapy. It's an extensive resume. So, also as an executive psychologist coaching multiple CEOs and VCs, many that I know. You also became popular by talking about the concept of dopamine fasting, which is something that we'll certainly discuss today. And helped start 3 different startups, worked as a venture advisor at Trinity and Magi Ventures, while also today being an advisor to 8VC. And recently, that's how we connected, you founded Maximus, which is a consumer health company providing men with content, community, clinical support to optimize their mind and body. Raised $5 million from a bunch of incredible investors, including Founders Fund, 8VC. This was a deal that I led when I was still at 1VC, and got capital as well from a bunch of operators from, founder Bulletproof, Tinder, Coinbase, Ryan, a Daily Stoic, and so forth. So Cam, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to continue our conversations.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I'd say that I think the reason that I was so interested in partnering with you and helping the mission of what you're building to the fullest extension is that I think both of us, having lived in the Bay Area at the same time, but both of us having left the Bay Area as well, I think we share this frustration where, for me, it was just so weird to be at a place where you had so much brilliance, but at the same time where a bunch of other aspects that I think make us who we are as humans were so weak in terms of the interactions and with each other. So, what made you choose cognitive neuroscience at Harvard, and how did this whole human behavior interest started for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was very fortunate to get into Harvard, and then I think at the time I actually wanted to double major. And at Harvard, it's called concentrate in psychology and biology, but the demands of that were too heavy, so they wouldn't actually allow people to do that. And so instead, I decided to concentrate in psychology with a focus in cognitive neuroscience, because it was almost kind of like a blend of psychology and biology. I ended up working at the Harvard Cognitive Neuroscience lab under a guy named Steve Koslin, who's one of the foremost leaders of the field. And the type of research they're doing was particularly fascinating to me. So he met the Dalai Lama at a Mind and Life conference at MIT. And the Dalai Lama was actually very progressive about promoting scientific inquiry, right? Because they obviously believe that meditation and some of the practices that come out of their Tibetan Buddhist tradition have emotional and health benefits. And Steve was like, well, let's test it. And so the Dalai Lama was down with that. He literally lent us or let us borrow some of his monks. And so he sent Mathieu Ricard, who is an interesting fellow himself. He's a former French Ph.D. in biochemistry scientist who actually became a Tibetan Buddhist monk and became the translator to the Dalai Lama because he spoke fluent French, was a scientist, but spent 30 years actually training as a monk. And so he was one of the rare, unique human beings who's like both a very proficient scientist and a proficient meditator as a monk. And so we brought him into the lab, and we used to do studies on emotional regulation, which is, can someone who with this much meditation practice better regulate or control their emotions? And we set up kind of almost computerized tasks that we actually originally developed for NASA, for the space program, because you want to make sure that someone's cognitively intact if they're going to literally step out of a space station and go for a walk, right? You want to make sure their memory and their processing speed and all these kind of things are intact. And so this is back in the day, it kind of dates me. We had PDAs, right? This is like a Palm Pilot kind of pre-iPhone devices. We set up these little programs, and they could, on a little Palm Pilot, essentially test if their, cognitive capacity was intact. So we took that, we translated it, and assessed essentially the ability of a Tibetan Buddhist monk to regulate their emotions. And they were, quite frankly, much, much better than the average college student in terms of being able to control their emotional response. So it's kind of fascinating, almost like tip of the stem research. But it was actually very promising. And in fact, it convinced me to start my own mindfulness and meditation practice, because I was like, this guy is better than, quite frankly, anyone that I've ever seen in a lab. We tested them very objectively. So I was like, maybe there is something to this meditation stuff. So I think that's how I kind of fell in love with the whole field of what I call mind-body medicine. It's interesting because in the East, especially those sort of Eastern traditions that I talked about, the mind and body are not separate, right? They're considered one. In West, we have this kind of Cartesian dualism between what we consider the mind and body. Like psychology is a good example of that, right? Like to become a psychologist, it's a separate training than most physicians, although there are psychiatrists, and they're sort of somewhere in between. But it's a very different kind of thing, and I think it's unfortunate because the reality is the integration of the fields of kind of mind and body requires sort of a multidisciplinary effort. And essentially that's what my whole career has been about. I've worked on a lot of conditions that span kind of mind and body, right? So my fellowship training is actually in behavioral medicine, which is the behavioral treatment of physical or chronic illnesses or conditions. So I spent a lot of time working diabetes, and a lot of people ask, well, what does a psychologist have to do with diabetes? Obviously, the blood sugar is not in their head, but it is very much a lifestyle disease, right? It's behaviors that mostly drive people to type 2 diabetes, much more than the genetic component. And so helping people obviously change their diet, their exercise, their sleep, all the behavioral components, actually, it has a much greater impact, quite frankly, than most medications do. And in fact, there's a whole clinical trial called the Diabetes Prevention Program that showed that a lifestyle intervention outperformed metformin, the gold standard diabetes drug, in helping people with prediabetes avoid type 2 diabetes. And that was basically the foray into starting into entrepreneurship for me.
What a wonderful answer. I think that when you combine, I remember the day I understood, I learned that we had after the brain, you have way more neurons in your intestines, right? And then you understand that entire correlation. And the Cartesian approach that you talked about, I think very few people actually know. I've read Descartes, and it's just so arrogant, right? Like just like I think that whole, I think therefore I exist, which is an unfortunate concept when you start learning more about Taoism and this whole body and mind integration from the East. But he wrote that, talking about the pandemic and people getting quarantined. He was actually like stuck in his apartment for a long time. And I really like that quote from Blaise Pascal. That's like, you can find tranquility if you can just sit by yourself for an hour a day, but then you go get your stuff done, right? You're not there. I think he was there for days in advance. So ultimately reaching this, in my opinion, inferior conclusion that, he is the center of the universe, which permeated for hundreds of years in Western civilization in an unfortunate way. And I think that, yeah.
And I think it's an unfortunate construct of almost like Western medicine. Unfortunately, because of the influence, I think, of managed care and insurance companies, the focus is really on pills and procedures, right? You either throw a medication at someone or you cut them open because it's quick, it's easy, it's profitable, quite frankly. And so as a result of that, behavioral interventions, I think, unfortunately get downplayed. Most doctors, quite frankly, don't have the time nor the training to do behavioral interventions. They don't make as much money as doing behavioral interventions because a psychiatrist can see 4 patients an hour that I see in an hour. And so all the incentives are unfortunately not aligned to do that. And so I think as a result, medicine has always been about, okay, what's the latest and greatest drug that we can develop, which is important and they have their place. But I think there's been a discounting of the behavioral component. And, it's crazy. Even I would say until the 1980s, really this mind-body dualism continued to persist in the field. The thing that got me really interested in continuing to pursue this in graduate school at UCLA was actually a book called Molecules of Emotion. And it was actually written by the woman who discovered the opiate receptor. Like you were talking about how many receptors there are in the gut, right? And discovered essentially like emotions highly influence your immune system function. But in the 1980s, you went to an immunologist and said, hey, the mind can communicate with the immune system and your emotions can influence your inflammation. That would have been like a crazy heretical notion. She actually did a lot of the early research that substantiated that. Other folks like Sheldon Cohen basically showed stress makes it much more likely that people get sick, which we kind of anecdotally knew, but he proved it. He actually did like lab studies where it's kind of crazy. They would inoculate people with a rhinovirus, a common cold, and based on people's level of stress, like they were much more likely to get it, or it would change the duration of the cold. So very like well designed laboratory studies. And then I in graduate school actually did the converse research. I was interested in looking at if positive emotions, life satisfaction, predicted levels of inflammation, which it did in the blood for months. And I was looking at breast and prostate cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy and radiation in a context where their immune system is obviously really important, that they can sort of fight the disease. But even that was pretty groundbreaking, right? I published that in Brain Behavior and Immunity when I was in grad school. There's almost no research on like how does positive emotions and life satisfaction influence the immune function, or even the notion that it can, right? And so, but I think that was really important research to do, because how do you convince an immunologist? By showing them really hard data, right? And so that's why, I did that research over at the Cousins Center for Psychoneuroimmunology, right? And so I was like, I want to do as hard science, as hard data as possible by showing blood markers, right? We literally did blood measurements every single month and showing that there's a very different response in people. And I think that's how the field and that's how sort of society becomes more and more convinced is, that's the beauty of science, right? Science is never sort of rigid in its points of view. When there's new data, you update your theories and you convince people that there's a different way going forward.
Absolutely. I remember also there was just this, it wasn't a scientific research, but when people were just basically even putting words, right, and certain intentions around water and the patterns that they would form, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think I saw that in the Secret movie.
And but it's interesting that I think that movie and that book, I think it did a massive disservice when you think about the evolution of yourself. As a person, you still got to do the work, but that ultimately having peace of mind and calmness just makes you better at whatever you need to get done. I think that's ultimately that conclusion, right? And we all have, to a degree, some sort of intuition when we are trying to accomplish something.
Yeah. So that's why I actually think that's the benefit of research. It's not that I think you're probably referring to the law of attraction, which is kind of the main theme of that movie. Obviously, you can't just sit there and manifest a Lamborghini. I wish that was the case. But there is something to be said about belief as self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Actually, one of my colleagues at UCLA did very clever research in which they would put people under what's called the Trier social stress test. This is like a standardized laboratory version of inducing stress. And it's actually almost like a podcast. You get someone, you stick them either in front of a camera or a live audience, and you have them speak extemporaneously for 2 minutes on a topic that they haven't prepared on, and the audience actually sits there and does not give them any positive feedback. They kind of grimace and they're looking very skeptical. That stresses people out, right? And what you can do is you can have them spit in the tube and measure their cortisol levels, right, which is their stress hormone, which just skyrockets because people are afraid of public speaking, and obviously you're getting negative feedback while you're public speaking, makes it twice as bad. But here's the interesting thing. He had them actually do positive affirmation in one randomized group of people, right? Where they're like, I can do this, my self-worth is safe with me, I can speak with confidence, etc., whatever it was. I don't remember the affirmations, but it's some sort of positive sort of affirmation. And it attenuated the cortisol spike. They still had an increase in cortisol, but it was like this compared to the control group, which was much higher, right? And so it was showing that on a physiological basis, right, you can measure this objectively with the stress hormone, that positive affirmations, at least before a concrete stressful task, can even change your physiology, right? So, it's really interesting because there's books, self-help books as far back as 100 years ago, James Allen's As a Man Thinketh. right? That's this whole philosophy of as a man thinks, so shall he become. The science is almost in some ways catching up to that. But I think that's the benefit of doing all this research is we understand where are the limits, right? You probably can't manifest Lamborghinis. Can you change or attenuate your hormone levels before you do something stressful? Probably. And so I think it's useful to explore, where the limits lie, and also what techniques are particularly helpful. Is it positive affirmation? Is it visualization? Is it, other things that may be helpful? And I think we're just going to get better and better at helping people connect between their mind and body, and then using it in a way that can help optimize their health and well-being.
Yes, absolutely. I think for me and what I've seen work really well for multiple founders or investors, folks that play in the field that we play, not just meditation, but also yoga, specifically hatha yoga, and then just trying to apply a few things from Ayurveda medicine, across the board. That certainly helps because the life that we live, specifically with the pandemic, sometimes with so many Zooms and social media, you can forget sometimes that you actually have a body, and just being sitting here in front of a desk, in front of screens all the time. And I think that all the social media hate comes from people like that. They're not out in the sun. They're not lifting weights. They're not exercising. So they just, they hate themselves because they're completely dissociated, their mind from their bodies. That is the ultimate Western disease, I would say, today, unfortunately.
I think Twitter is an anger video game in which people project their personal problems onto other people. So unfortunately, it's reinforced by likes and retweets as the high score, as I like to say. But yeah, that's sort of the name of the game, and they've kind of cleverly gamified that. I'm not sure it's of great social benefit, but it's a double-edged sword. Obviously, I've gotten a lot of Twitter, a lot of people. It's funny. I was just interviewing a senior software engineering candidate, and this guy can go work anywhere, work for all these stellar companies. And interestingly, he gave me feedback. He's like, I wouldn't be talking to you if I didn't think you were an interesting person, and I learned all about you through social media, right? And so I was like, well, that's kind of an interesting benefit, is you can almost like put your personality, philosophy, et cetera, out there, and it almost resonates, if you will, with the water analogy that you made, and with other people who are, if you want to call it resonance, vibration, frequency, or just shared values and points of view, perspectives. I think it does put it out there, and people sort of gravitate. Now, I do think that's a double-edged sword, because obviously extreme views, cultish kind of practices also can self-congregate together and amplify one another, particularly if they join closed circles, like a closed Facebook group, and then they're just reinforcing their weird philosophy or unhealthy practices. So that's the downside. But I also think it helps a lot of people, particularly in the world, who feel like they are alone, right? Actually, the guy that I was talking to lives on an island, and he's like, there's not a lot of intellectual stimulation here. And it's nice to be able to connect across the pond with people who are, a little bit more intellectual, a little bit more psychologically insightful. So that's why I really have a love-hate relationship with technology. I think it's tremendous. Obviously, I wouldn't be working in tech if I didn't think it was tremendously beneficial. But it's a very blunt tool, and I really think the design of what you apply it for is really, that's what influences health, right? If you're optimizing for eyes on ads, I think by definition it is unhealthy. If you're optimizing, obviously, and designing a program to benefit someone's health, then it can be tremendously beneficial. So it's just be careful kind of what you wish for, and be careful what you're designing for.
Yeah, that's right. I think, but it's interesting when you're talking about tribalism across the board, right? Because if you leave enough monkeys by themselves, they will start, killing each other, throwing shit at each other. And then ultimately, right, it was the entire creation of culture and some sort of fabric of society that allowed us to not do that. Although sometimes I feel like that's what's happening in some of these timelines and so forth. But but actually talking about your evolution, right, professionally. So, you went from this, from being a scientist to then start actually working in technology. When was the moment that clicked and you felt like moving to San Francisco? Because you worked in consulting before as well. So just learning more about that journey would be interesting.
Well, I talked about my research in grad school. I thought psychoneuroimmunology was a fascinating field. On the other hand, I felt like it was so far away from clinical application. Right, the field needed 10 to 20 years more of research to really get out there and do it. And ultimately, the reason I decided to pursue that is like, while it's intellectually interesting, and I obviously love talking about this stuff, is there's no utility of doing great research if it doesn't go out and help people, right? And so I really, one of my values is like public health and public impact. And I realized that unfortunately working in academia, with some rare exceptions, is probably not the optimal way if you want to help as many people as possible, unless you kind of become more of a public figure kind of professor. So I think I decided very early on that like being an academic research professor at an R1 university was not the path for me. So I became a little bit more interested in the clinical side of things. I did my fellowship in behavioral medicine, as I mentioned. And what I ended up doing was running a behavioral diabetes management program with really sick patients. So these were folks that had double-digit A1C levels, meaning their blood sugar levels were completely out of control, a lot of side effects, some of as extreme as like having an amputated leg already. So these are the kind of the worst of the worst, patients, and they often had comorbid mental health issues. Like 90+% of them were depressed, and so no wonder they weren't treating their diabetes or taking their medications, and their doctors were upset at them. They had mental health issues, and they didn't necessarily want to live. So you don't care about your diabetes or your chronic health if you're struggling, with your kind of fundamental life. So we would obviously assess them, make sure they're getting appropriate mental health care for their depression, their PTSD, whatever that's kind of going on underneath the surface. And then we do intensive group therapy. So literally I'd have guys come in every single week, and then we work on the psychological and behavioral aspects of taking care of themselves, especially as it pertains to their diabetes. It worked really well. I think a lot of guys really benefit from social support, right? These are military veterans, often Vietnam era, guys who are over 65. They're isolated, other than usually their wife did not have a lot of strong connections. And really in addition to the medical aspect, I actually think the psychological aspect of putting men together in a group, providing friendships, relationships, also a shared experience of going through something together. If you think about it, that's part of the military, right? You literally go to battle together, go to war together, and those relationships often last for decades, even if you haven't seen people. Going and fighting diabetes is a little different than fighting an enemy, but you're fighting something, and you're doing that with other people who are going through the same experience. And I think that was tremendously helpful, in some ways even more helpful than just one-on-one kind of work with me, because, I'm this young, super fit kind of person, and this this 65-year-old guy who's like struggling with his eating. The relatability may not always be there, but I think when you're doing it with the context of me and other people who are true peers, I think it can help a lot. And that was my experience. The downside, of course, of that was you got to get someone to drive to a hospital every week, sometime between Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Which you have a stable job. That's obviously not really feasible. I had a patient come up to me after group one day, and he's like, "Hey doc, I can't come back anymore because I have one car and I have 5 family members. I can't take a car every week." And I realized it first of all, it broke my heart, because I was like, this guy's doing really well and he's going to drop out of treatment. But also I was like, this is that's not a medical issue. This is a socioeconomic issue. And how do you treat that, right? That's beyond the scope of my practice. But I sort of realized it's partly my fault, in the sense of, why am I dragging this poor guy to come to a hospital every week, especially because we're not doing something procedural where he physically needs to be there. The VA at the time was actually piloting telemedicine, just as we're doing now, but it was only reserved for people who were live too far away from the hospital for have them to come in. So they'd come into a remote satellite clinic and be able to seek care. But I was like, this makes sense. I should be doing this all through telemedicine. But I was like, I think it's going to take 10 years for the field to catch up, because unfortunately medicine moves really slow. But I said, I want to make my career about that, essentially, is how do you make evidence-based treatments accessible and scalable to as many people as possible, millions of people, right? And so I literally took that experience in 2012, moved out to Silicon Valley, and I helped start Amada Health. I was their founding medical director, and literally took the same thing that I was doing in a hospital setting and created an online version of it. So we created an online diabetes prevention program. Fortunately, we focused on folks that were not so sick, who had pre-diabetes, so they had high blood sugar, but they weren't quite diabetic yet. And then essentially created an online behavioral intervention where we help people lose about 5 to 10% of their body weight. and then spent the next 5 years scaling that company to a few hundred employees. It's basically a unicorn company now, and it's helped 500,000 people lose 5 million pounds, which is way more than I would have ever been able to do if I just stayed working in a hospital. So that's how I kind of got into tech. I half joke that I'm a reluctant entrepreneur or techie, because to me, I was like, I never wanted to, I don't know, be Bill Gates or start a company. I just wanted to help as many people. But I realized the best way of doing that is through starting a venture-backed company and using the technology platforms as a way of disseminating it so that people can basically get really good care anytime, any place in the comfort and convenience of their own homes.
That's great. And when you left Omada, I mean, you guys were over 150 people at this point or something like that?
Yeah, and
or more.
Including health coaches, is like close to 300. So I trained and supervised about 150 health coaches that were distributed all across the country, and they're the folks that were delivering the care.
What were some of the most interesting experiences or important experiences now that you're building Maximus that you took from that hyper growth period, right, through Omada?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess there's two. I'll talk a little bit like internally in terms of company building, and then I'll talk externally in terms of product building. Company building is hard, right? To go from 3 to 300 people in less than 5 years is very difficult because first of all, it's an incredible recruiting challenge, right? How do you do that in a very rapid period of time? And you're literally bursting the seams. I remember literally like going from 5-person office, 10-person office, 50-person office, 100-person office, building furniture literally like on the weekends so that we could accommodate that. And it's not the pace that like working, for instance, at the federal government hospital operates, right? So that's an interesting challenge. But I think the challenge particularly with recruiting is because you're trying to get butts in seats and you're trying to hyper grow. I think companies oftentimes compromise in terms of hiring, right? Especially in terms of the culture, because especially with very technical roles, it's very hard to hire engineers, hard to hire data scientists, et cetera. It's really a buyer's market, right? They can kind of go work wherever they want. I remember, in fact, like when we did $23 million Series B at Andreessen, and there was someone who was hanging out at Andreessen who was basically like, I'm a hot commodity, put me in your hottest portfolio company. And we wouldn't have been able to hire that person otherwise until we had the Andreessen logo and the funding. But that person was like, yeah, I'm going to go work for the hot rocket ship startup, and literally place me there, right? So that's the kind of thing that you get. And the problem, though, is some of those people, they have the ego and arrogance that kind of goes along with that. And it's very easy at a company where you're desperate to hire more engineers, more technical talent, that you're going to compromise in terms of your culture and your values. And I think, quite frankly, we did at certain points do that. I think it was a mistake because all of those people either voluntarily or involuntarily left at some point. And it really causes like negative ramifications, right? Because, my thesis is even if you're a 10x,
absolutely,
you're going to have a net productivity loss because you're demoralizing and causing conflict with all the people around you. So even if you are theoretically 10x better, you're going to get 10 people around you to cut their productivity in half, and it's kind of net neutral, if not negative. And so, on the basis of a lot of these experiences, I ended up actually, we did two things. I think I developed a system called the Performance Values Matrix, and I actually convinced our CEO to implement this in terms of our performance reviews. And the basic philosophy is, look, it's not that these are fundamentally bad people, but that the incentives are not aligned. Meaning that if you're technically, or in terms of your job performance, incredibly talented, and you're a hot commodity and you're basically unfireable, why do you need to act nice? Why do you need to be a team player? You don't. Quite frankly, it's not what you are rewarded for. It's not what you're promoted for. And you can't basically be fired. So people, no wonder they act out of line, because that you set up the game and structure to be as such. And so my argument was the only way that you can get people, and I'm a behaviorist at heart, right? Like everything is rewarded punishment and reinforcement, is you have to reinforce people the right way. And so we developed our performance review system to be like 50% is based on your performance, your job performance, and 50% is based on values aligned behaviors. Meaning like if the company says teamwork and collaboration and integrity and all these other things are values, then you need to assess people on those. You need to make it part of their performance review, and you need to use that in terms of your promotion processes. And so theoretically, even if you're a high performer, if you neglect the other 50%, you cannot get an outstanding performance review and you won't get promoted. And so I think that really incentivizes people the right way because it's built into the process and structure. And I ended up writing a whole series about it. You can Google it. It's called Your Company Culture is Who You Hire, Fire, and Promote. I've actually given talks at venture companies, including True Ventures and all their portfolio companies, about this. And I basically, tell all other portfolio company founders that, look, everyone writes their values, right? You have it in some Notion document or it's literally on your wall somewhere, and nobody follows this, right? Because there's no reinforcement for it. So my argument is it's not, you can't just stop at writing your values. You have to, first of all, you have to measure it, right? So how do you know you're even living up to your values? You should be doing some sort of surveys, culture surveys, et cetera, and asking people, do we live up to the values that we say are important? Why or why not? You should be taking active efforts to improve it if there is a gap in terms of figuring out what's causing the deficits. And you need to build it into your how you hire, fire, and promote people. So like literally in our interview processes, like the values that we say are important, we assess for it. There's specific questions that A, B, and C. Is this person kind of meeting those criteria, right? And then in terms of how we promote or fire people, it's built into the performance review process as well. So I think you have to kind of integrate it that way. And I think that was a critical lesson. And ultimately, you have to also decide where the line is, right? I really love Professor Bob Sutton of Stanford's work. He has a book called The No Asshole Rule. And I think it's critical for companies to do that. A lot of companies say they have a no asshole rule, they don't practice it. And I think you really have to make that determination in terms of how you hire and fire and promote people, in terms of where do you draw the line. And I think it was a tough lesson that we sort of learned there. I do think over time we did remedy it by kind of building it into that. But I always said basically, the next company that I start, I'm going to do it literally from the outset, and we're not going to make exceptions, because it's very easy, especially at the beginning. You make an exception for one hire, and especially that person's a manager, the head of a department, they're going to influence all the people that come after them. So a lot of people here, hire A players because they're going to hire A players. If you hire a B player who's at the top, they're only going to hire B players. I think it's the same thing for values. If you hire someone who's kind of iffy in terms of the values component, they're also going to hire people who are a little bit questionable, and it will absolutely dilute your culture. So I think your founding team in particular needs to be stellar exemplars of the cultural values that you want to have, because they're going to gravitate naturally, personality-wise, and in terms of who they hire, to people who are very similar to them. So I think that was actually the most important thing that I learned beyond all the healthcare stuff at Omada.
This is an incredible answer. It's funny because now, as I'm building a new firm, and we're basically now close to getting to about 7 people, and I spent the last 6 months getting to know so many people deeply, making sure that I would not compromise at all on values and principles. And that gets to a point, certainly didn't have this ultra efficient framework, but it meant more even meeting their families, right? Learning how do they treat others, and then experimenting as well in the arena. So I completely changed how my entire thought process in terms of recruiting. It's hard to do that once the company is fully up and running and you have HR and all these other things, but before. And venture allows that flexibility as well, because you can do a deal separate from, having a full fund here with some people and then do another deal. And you have to, I would even say that you want to over optimize for that, in addition to also over optimizing for someone that has an incredible ability to learn, because things change so fast that they got to learn rapidly. And also folks that want to inflect together in life. That's also something that even when it comes from the founder and investor relationship, oftentimes some of the most successful investors, they'll be folks that are already, they're beyond at the personal level with like fuck you money. But I've learned by seeing founders, for instance, exiting way earlier, whereas they could have had, for instance, a secondary and continuing on the mission, the importance of really understanding when we partner with someone is like, what are they interested in doing in the next 4 years of their life? It's not even just the company building. Is if it works out and they have the opportunity to make a lot of money, what does a lot of money means to you, and how would you handle that, right? Like, these are very important questions that oftentimes in the diligence process people don't even think about. So it's a great answer.
It's an evolving process. Like, something we didn't do at Amada, but something I do at my company now because I run it is I really am like influenced by some of the behavioral economists and some of the Moneyball folks in terms of how do you take quantitative methods and apply it to qualitative fields. I think psychology is actually the great example of that. People think psychology is very qualitative, but you go to a grad program, they do I took multiple years of advanced statistics. A lot of the research that's done is very quantitative now. In fact, there's an entire field of quantitative psychology. And so what we do, which is actually pretty unique amongst other companies, is we do quantitative personality and IQ testing for every single one of our employees. I can literally tell you, with some degree of accuracy, their personality profiles and literally their intelligence levels. And I really think it actually gives us a competitive advantage because, one, we're much less likely to make mistakes in hiring. So as I mentioned, we have a no asshole rule. How do you quantify being an asshole? Some of it's obviously intuitive, but I actually think people who are relatively socially skilled can kind of hold it together for a first couple interviews. Usually comes out eventually, right? But when you're in a fast hiring process, especially for these high demand kind of fields, you don't have necessarily a lot of time to slow roll decisions. So as a result, using the quantitative methods can be very helpful in making sure they're not extremes on, for instance, traits like disagreeableness, which is kind of a proxy for assholism, if you will. I believe that's the clinical term for it. And then the same thing with intelligence. Obviously going to an Ivy League university or an SAT score is a decent actually proxy for intelligence. It's imperfect, but it's directionally correct. But in the absence of that data, and also there's a lot of folks who, for other personal, family, location, geographical reasons, did not have that opportunity. You can find diamonds in the rough, right? And Keith Raboy talks about this all the time. Is like there's a competitive advantage in being able to hire people who are the non-obvious folks. Right? Everyone's going to compete over the Stanford CS grad who has 1 million job offers, and they're going to have very high expectations also as well. But you can probably find someone who's just as intelligent, just as hardworking, etc., with a non-conventional resume. But I think you have to use non-conventional methods in order to find those people. So because we're very quantitative, we can find people who, just looking based on their LinkedIn profile, you wouldn't think they're stellar, but I can tell you objectively that they are, and in fact, maybe even better than some of the folks, conversely, who they're worked at all the right companies or went to the right schools, but they're a little off in certain respects. So I think that's actually a huge advantage in terms of what we do. And the second thing is I actually think it creates a competitive advantage in terms of creating true diversity and inclusion. This is a whole interesting topic of discussion right now in Silicon Valley in terms of wanting to promote diversity and inclusion. I'm an immigrant entrepreneur myself, so I'm obviously in favor of that. But I think the methods that people are going about it is completely wrong, right? First of all, where it's very arbitrary what we consider diversity and who is considered a person of color. It's kind of a joke, quite frankly, in terms of like we arbitrarily select groups that are particularly in favor and ones that are not.
I'll remind you the day I learned I was brown in America as a Brazilian, thinking I grew up white in Brazil, and not that I really care, but that was a fascinating. I've been in the U.S. for 12 years. It's fascinating learning experience.
Are you white? Are you brown? It's kind of however you want to be or self-identify, right? That's the other thing. There's no objective truth anymore. Anyone can technically identify as whatever, which is also like points out how silly and arbitrary sort of this thing is. But look, there is a benefit to obviously having people of different backgrounds, age. By the way, ages, that's the other thing too that I think is hilarious about Silicon Valley. They care so much about the melanin level of your skin as the measure of your diversity, but they don't care about like socioeconomic diversity. They don't care about the age, because there's huge bias obviously towards younger folks at companies, and they don't care about intellectual diversity. So we create a very fake or artificial diversity based on certain people of certain melanin groups or genders, quite frankly, that we want, versus like a true actual diversity. And my thesis is you get diversity by not targeting diversity, because you run into the same problems you talked about. Who is considered a person of color or not, right? Instead of getting into that unwinnable argument, my philosophy, and I think a lot of other mission-focused companies are aligned with this, is you focus on being a meritocracy, right? You try to make it as fair as possible. Nothing is going to be completely fair or completely accurate. We know that like even personality and IQ testing is not perfectly accurate or unbiased, but I will tell you it is much less biased than all the other methods that people use, which is just subjective interviews. People are very biased. They like hiring people who look like them or have similar personalities to them or went to the same schools as them because of affinity. That's how we are. We're kind of tribal people, as you kind of mentioned, right? So overly relying, I think, on subjective interviews is very biased. And so anything that you can do to depart from that is generally in the right direction. What we have found through experience is when you try to hire as objectively as possible, as merit-based as possible, you naturally get diversity, right? You get people of all kinds of interesting cultural backgrounds, immigration statuses, intellectual diversity, etc. So I think that's the other benefit too. Is I would argue our diversity is actually just as good, if not significantly better, than most other companies, because we don't focus on it directly, and we have it be the natural byproduct of a fair system. And I think that's the only way to do it, in my opinion. That may be sort of a contrarian view, but I think that also attracts people who care about being in meritocracy, right? I actually argue we get higher performing people because higher performing people want to be at a meritocracy because they know they're high performers. They know they work hard. They know that they're better than average. And if they're at a meritocracy, they know they're going to get promoted. They're going to be rewarded for their work effort versus, oh, I'm passing you over because we need to fill a quota in a box and you happen to not have the genetic makeup that we're looking for to make our outside whatever, happy, right? So ironically, the more diversity, inclusion, people, and officers you have as a company, it attracts lower performers because they know that they can quite frankly hide at those places versus kind of be at a more meritocracy-oriented place. And the last thing, too, is literally in every single one of our job ads, we say, look, we're an equal opportunity employer. We don't discriminate on the basis of any demographic factors, but we also particularly value intellectual diversity. And unfortunately, I think in Silicon Valley, this is a rare thing. Like if you're at a Google, as we saw in the James Damore scandal and a bunch of other things, or a large tech company, you cannot be open with whether it's your personal beliefs, your philosophical beliefs, your political beliefs, if they're not mainstream, right? And we saw this obviously with the guy who fired from Apple, even though he wrote a book 5 years ago that they knew about, but 1% of the company wrote a petition and mutinied and got him fired, right? And so I think I'm very public in our social media, and I said we're not going to fire people on the basis of their personal beliefs. Now, as long as it's aligned with the values of the company, right? If you hate men and you probably shouldn't work at a men's health company, it's probably not aligned. But other than the obvious, we want diversity of opinion. We want diversity of beliefs. We want diversity of political orientations. At the same time, I do believe in the mission-oriented or mission-focused philosophy, right? In that the company's not going to become about your politics, right? You can talk about it at the water cooler. That's fine. We're never going to discriminate against anyone for that. But our focus is to optimize men's health, and that's our cause. That's our mission, and that's where we're going to fly our banner underneath, and that's what we're going to push for. And I think it attracts people who, like I said, are attracted to that philosophy, and in my experience, it attracts, quite frankly, better people.
I agree 100% with what you're talking about, Cam. The only flaw that I think that there could be in that logic, in terms of because I certainly subscribe to the fact that the monoculture of Silicon Valley is terrible, and that these big tech companies are absolutely uncreative. Ultimately, they're just lobotomizing people that should be self-actualizing, but like they can make 300, 400, 500, $1.5 million by just doing very little work, and getting pampered, treated like babies. Hey, let me feed you, like wash your clothes and so forth. But the problem that I think it's tough when to take your argument to the fullest extension, and I don't know the solution to that problem, so that's why I'm asking you that question as someone that agrees with everything you said, is there, you are super busy, you've raised a bunch of venture, you're building the business, and then you're the same issue that you talked about. Hey, when I was at the hospital, I realized that there's a bigger socioeconomical problem here. It's not just finding treatment for these people. In this particular situation, there are a bunch of minorities that would never be in a position to even understand. I know that that's not our problem, but they wouldn't understand what, Maximus or Atman is, or all these companies and venture. And, we can't say that like we're going to solve all the problems in the world. I think that I remember, Keith that, invested in Maximus said, like, yeah, I want to do I want to rewrite Twitter, right? Like that's a complex, like fucking goal. But my point is, how is it that these people will know, like, to actually get to a point where you have true diversity? Because when I am not aware of it, I always find myself in my own little micro bubble, which ultimately consists of diverse ideas, because I am far more on the libertarian conservative side, and I have way more liberal friends, and they know it, and we talk about it. And, I have a very specific way I live my life, and I just find that maybe who said this in a good way was Jason Lemkin, when he was basically looking at the diversity numbers of the early days of SaaStr versus the later days, while still keeping the quality of ideas. So there needs to be some sort of effort at the top of the funnel where messaging feels approachable, while you don't have to make compromises on the intellectual performance side, right? Which I think is the big issue here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I actually think the way that people measure diversity is completely flawed, right? They're looking at the very basic demographic numbers and they're making an argument, oh, we're diverse, right? When that's not true diversity. There isn't a sort of, I think it's a socialist notion, right? So for instance, let's use this 50-50 notion of gender equality. That is completely wrong. You know how many out of 100 plus fields have 50.0 gender equality?
Almost none, probably, right?
Zero. It is literally zero.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's obvious extremes. If you look at carpenters and bricklayers, it's like 97% men. Versus if you look at things like kindergarten or preschool teachers, it's 97% women. There are clear personal, cultural, maybe even genetic preferences for certain types of field. Now, you can sit there and argue is a biopsychosocial is probably some combination thereof, but you'll never have 50-50 equality because there's natural gravitations of people towards the field. So I think that's an example. And like, by the way, nobody complains, right? Everyone's like, how come there's not more female CEOs and board members? Nobody complains there's not more female carpenters and bricklayers and construction workers, right? So there's a little bit of an ironic double standard, I think, with some of these things. So I think it's the wrong metric in that there's going to be some natural divergence in terms of preferences. And some of it's maybe cultural, right? Like, I grew up in San Diego. There's a lot of like Filipino nurses. I don't think it's a genetic thing. I think it's like a socially cultural, it's prestigious in the culture. It's a good paying job. It's very stable, especially if you're an immigrant. And if you know a lot of people who you have cousins who do that, you're going to follow in their footsteps, right? So that may be a constructed, phenomenon, but I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong for it. And so what are you going to do? They're clearly overrepresented, for instance, in nursing, relative to their preponderance in the population. So are you going to actively discriminate against Filipinos and say they're overrepresented in nursing, and so we're going to decrease their numbers? It seems discriminatory. So that's why I think it's very, you have to be very careful in terms of how you measure the success of diversity. I think, ironically, it's going to become a lot more qualitative in terms of not just the look, but the feel of your company. And I think the problem is there's too much of a focus on the look, right? Like, does the website in the terms of the people look diverse, which is obviously very arbitrary, right? And you discriminate against the people who are a bunch of white-looking people, even though they may have, have very diverse backgrounds, right? I tell people this. I've been actively discriminated against in venture because I'm white-looking. Even though I'm a first-generation immigrant, I learned English as a third language, even though I speak it very fluently, obviously. But then on a website, right? Does it provide the diversity that you're looking for? These are the silly things, these silly games that sort of Silicon Valley, I think, plays. And unfortunately, like it's not sort of safe that you can talk about these things. I don't really care, so I'm very public about it. And I think, quite frankly, companies have two perspectives or points of view when it comes to the top of funnel. I think most companies, 95% of them, are like, let's not stick out. Let's follow the status quo. Let's rubber stamp diversity and inclusion so we can make everyone feel safe. We don't want to look any different than any other company because we don't want to do anything, to your point, at the top of funnel to accidentally exclude or turn off anyone, right? They're so afraid, essentially, of actually doing that. I think, personally, that's a mistake. Maybe that makes sense for a very large corporation, I would say. But I would say for a startup, it's a mistake because this is the most competitive job market we've ever seen. If you talk to any recruiters in the last 20 years, there's capital flowing everywhere. Everyone's hiring. It is a war for talent. So we take an asymmetrical approach when we're saying we have a different point of view when it comes to hiring. Like I said, we're much more quantitative than qualitative. We're much more meritocratic versus forcing quotas. We're about quality of opportunity, not quality of outcomes. And then these are non-standard, I would say, maybe even heretical approaches, at least in Silicon Valley. And so it will attract a different type of people. I'm sure, absolutely, it pushes away some people as well. I actually think it's a good thing because I think if you don't stand for anything, for something, you don't stand for anything. And it's good, I think, in my opinion, for a startup in terms of the war for talent to stand out in some way, hopefully in a positive way, because that's the only way you're going to win, right? You can't outpay people. You can't outpay fake companies in Google. And, if you're even if you're a basic, boring SaaS product, it's not more exciting to go work on a widget than any other thing, right? So if you don't have the money, you don't have the mission, what are you competing against, right? You have to have at least a point of view or something that attracts people in terms of your personality, the team, the culture, that is a competitive advantage. And I think, quite frankly, we have a competitive advantage because I'm one of the very few founders that's willing to stick their neck out and have a fucking point of view about what is actually fair and equal. And like I said, I think it's the right thing to do. And I think companies should, quite frankly, exclude, not on the basis of demographics, but they should exclude people on the basis of not being aligned with being mission driven, because those people are huge headaches for the company. And I'm more than happy to exclude people who are not aligned with our philosophical point of view, because we need people who are soldiers and feel very aligned with the mission and aligned with the way that we're doing things. I don't have, by the way, any illusions that what we're doing is perfect, right? But I think about it as a scientist, like I said, just like I was saying that science has updated their theories about mind-body medicine, we're going to update our methodologies, we're going to update our testing, we're going to update our philosophies. I hope to be wrong in 5 years and say I have a better view now than I did because I've learned from it, right? I think as a result of that iteration, we're going to be better than we are in 5 years, and we're going to be attracting people who are at least aligned with our initial hypothesis and are willing and have the psychological flexibility to grow along with us versus someone who's like, this is the only way it should be, my way or the highway, and are not open to sort of a better way of doing things.
I mean, that is super important. And there is a growing trend of more people like yourself that are comfortable speaking their mind and ultimately saying, look, I worked very hard to be in a position where I'm uncancelable because through the power of my own authenticity and basic logic, which I think it's something that many people, they're just trapped in a place where that is not true. It was fascinating, to see, I think 2 points here. Number one is that I always look for companies that are run like dictatorships, but where people are happy, so it's more of a China model of management than this kumbaya stuff that the US is becoming. But it's a good, because you got to move really fast and the buck needs to stop with someone and it's important. I think that the best companies, they have really strong cultures, and even IBM or HP in the early days, they had these little song books and people would do all sorts of rituals in the 60s and 70s. And we're losing a lot of that. And that is truly what brings the positive aspects, I would say, of tribalism. And the second part It's also something you've mentioned about, hey, we can absolutely disagree on things and have our own personal preferences, but look, the company is not about a certain type of, political party or theme, which would, what Brian Armstrong did at Coinbase recently, right? That whole thing about, look, we'll pay you 6 months of salary, don't sue us, but just get the fuck out, because like this, in this part of, in this organization, you're not going to be, doing what is happening at Apple or Google and so forth. So many people criticized that, or they were even shocked about that. For me, that was very normal. I was like, look, it's great that you're just resolving this issue at scale and remove these people. Whereas you look at other companies like Expensify, I'm a customer and I received this email supporting Joe Biden. And I was like, look, you're just an expense report tool. It's fine. I hope that you have people that vote for both sides or whatever, but that's irrelevant for our relationship as a customer. You should not be sending me this email. It's absolutely inappropriate, and you're not the fucking savior of the world. So it's just fascinating to see the lack of maturity of some of these leaders. I think it's interesting, So I definitely think that that's a competitive advantage that you guys have in terms of recruiting. But actually we're at about an hour. Usually we do a little break if you want to just stretch or go to the restroom, and then talk about Maximus on the, does that work?
Let's do it.
So after Omada, you actually started a company in the keto space, right? Before founding Maximus. So, and you sold it. So what was that company about?
So one of the things I interestingly learned at Omada was a lot of people were going outside the program and actually buying meal replacements because they're, trying to improve their nutrition and lose weight. And obviously the best thing that anyone can do is to eat home-cooked food. Actually, that's, by the way, that's the biggest weight loss tip that I ever have. If you just improve the proportion of foods that you prepare at home, you will improve your health and lose weight. The problem is, in obviously a very convenience-oriented and busy society, people are not at home, they're really busy, they don't have the time, the energy, etc. And so there is a convenience play in terms of using a meal replacement. The problem is everything on the market is garbage. Like if you look at Soylent, it's terrible. It's optimized for cost. Like so they literally sell it to college students who are running out of dorm meal plan foods.
Soylent's a disaster for...
Yeah, and I've actually tested, by the way.
Soylent is the drink of that ethos that destroyed Silicon Valley, that had people throwing rocks at the Google bus 6 years ago.
Exactly.
In my opinion, it's a great company. I met and there's no demerit on the actual entrepreneurship journey there, but that product is a net negative for the world.
It's brilliant marketing, right? That's the brilliance of the company, and I give the founders credit. They're brilliant troll marketers, is what I say. They went out and said, "Look, you don't need to eat food. We're going to be the end of food." And then they got in every single magazine, got millions of dollars of free publicity. That's why that company blew up. The product itself is not good. It's made out of literally like soy protein, canola oil, or some refined seed oils, and they basically hide the fact that it's also full of sugar because they use complex polysaccharides that break down the sugar. But I've actually tested my glucose response.
Also tastes like shit.
Yeah.
In my opinion, at least, but yeah.
It's not good for you. And obviously, at the same time, there's this huge consumer push into keto, right? So ketogenic diets or low-carb, high-fat diets were becoming very... there's a lot of research evidence that's actually coming out about how they really should be the first-line treatment for diabetes. And so we started to adopt that at Omada. There's entire other companies like Virta Health, that's their entire philosophy, right? They essentially package the ketogenic diet and they help folks with type 2 diabetes implement it. And I really think for folks who have trouble controlling their blood sugar levels because they're on the diabetes spectrum or the cardiometabolic syndrome spectrum, it is the best diet of choice. Unfortunately, there's nothing on the market that was like keto friendly and a meal replacement. And so that's essentially what we did was we reduced ketogenic meal replacements for people, not as a substitute for food, is what I'm saying, but it's like, look, if you don't have time to cook or you're on the go, you're traveling, then it provides a substitute product. Because one of the other interesting things that I learned about nutrition is it's not about optimizing in terms of like superfruits, as great as it is, people should go have some acai. It's really about harm reduction. The best thing you can do in terms of optimizing your nutrition is cutting out the junk more than trying to get some really exotic, crazy, kind of food that are extra good for you. Because so much of what we eat is junk, right? If you look at the average American calorie consumption, 66% approximately, or 2/3, is ultra processed food, right? Highly packaged, highly processed, not that good for you food. Less than a third of food is actually like home cooked, whole, relatively unprocessed food. So that's kind of the product that we created, and is based on as much like whole food sources as possible. And it also took a very contrarian view. The trend right now is all plant based, which there's no science behind it. In fact, it's inferior in terms of protein. Whey protein, dairy-based protein is by far superior in terms of its bioavailability. So we were a proudly animal-based product that was dairy-based. And then that was sort of, I call it my consumer MBA. I decided not to venture back that company on purpose, coming off of Omada, which raised hundreds of millions of dollars, because it's not as necessary in CPG to raise unless you're doing growth. But I wanted to just learn as much as I can about consumer and consumer marketing. Had a good learning experience, had an opportunity to just kind of sell it early, and then get into the venture side of things. So did that, and then I ended up at Trinity Ventures, helping them out with their consumer and health tech practice. So I spent a year there as an EIR, an entrepreneur in residence, and got into the venture side of things, which I can talk about, and how that kind of turned into Maximus.
It's interesting that not a lot of people know that Trinity actually invested in P.F. Chang's and Starbucks. Before they did Bulletproof, right? It's they are exactly. I remember when I saw that on their portfolio page, I was like, "Oh, this is before a bunch of people started doing D2C and CPG, right?" So basically, very, very, very interesting. And I'm aware that you had multiple choices, right? So ultimately, was there a moment where you realized, wow, I need to make this my mission with Maximus and improve both mental health, quality of life for men at scale? When did you realize that was the idea?
So when I went to Trinity, I told them I'm not starting another company, even though I'm like an EIR. That's typically what EIRs do. Usually a serial entrepreneur, and they have you hang out there for a year, help them invest, meet, work with portfolio companies, essentially to get first dibs. But I told them, look, I'm here just as kind of a transition phase, and also I want to learn about health tech investing. They're like, okay, that's no problem, no pressure. And so I was actually doing that, and I was very happy doing it. I was both helping their investing. I set up my own AngelList syndicate called Magi Ventures. I was doing a bunch of deals. I'm still a clinical professor at UCSF, so I trained a psychiatry residents an afternoon a week. And then I have a private practice, as you mentioned. So I actually I'm an executive psychologist. I coach tech CEOs and VCs. So that's all. I hang out with folks like you who are doing great work. And help them optimize their health and performance. So, I always had my fingers dabbling in a bunch of different things. And I was very happy doing that. And it was kind of interesting though. In just spending time, and going along, I just started to notice there was some very interesting trends that were going on. And it's actually related to the biopsychosocial thing that, we were talking about earlier. So one was a really fascinating statistic, and it almost makes me think of the early, the story of Amazon, right? Jeff Bezos I forgot, he was working at some investment bank, Shaw or something, and he saw some crazy statistic about how fast the internet was growing, and he's like, oh my God, I'm in the wrong field. I almost had that similar aha moment when I read somewhere, and I didn't even believe this until I read into the research, that testosterone levels have been going down. Total testosterone has been going down 1%. Bioavailable testosterone has been going down 1.3% a year, which basically means in the last 50 years, bioavailable testosterone has gone down 65%, right? So if you compare yourself to your grandfather, he had almost 2.9 times more testosterone than you did. So there's a great article in Forbes about this. It's literally called "You're Not the Man Your Father Was," which I was like, oh, what a burn, right? But it's true, and this trend has been going on for decades, and it's kind of alarming. And it's not just testosterone, right? It's literally sperm count has been going down like 1% a year. And in fact, they're so worried about it. They're like, this has been a linear trend. Are we going to eventually get to sperm count 0 and not be able to reproduce as a species? And it's such a robust phenomenon. Even the dogs that people have as pets, their sperm count is going down too. And so one of the theories behind this is it's not just that everyone's obese. 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. 88% are metabolically dysregulated. So we're obviously much less healthy than our fathers and our grandfathers' generation. That's a huge contributing factor, obesity, depression. But there's also environmental factors. So there are these endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in our food, our drinks, our plastics, our air and water that are disrupting our hormonal profile. And I know it sounds crazy and kind of conspiratorial, but there's actually a lot of compelling evidence that that's true. Like literally the BPA people have heard about in water bottles was eventually banned because they realized that it is an endocrine disrupting chemical. It's really bad.
I remember a post that you posted that I was so sad when I saw the level of toxicity from Topo Chico water.
Yeah, I know.
And I saw it from you on Twitter. Now I only drink, Pellegrinos, and then because they're the healthiest ones with carbonation, I'd say, because God knows what natural flavors from LaCroix is, but it's kind of but the number of times where you have an issue, even when you're trying really hard to be healthy, on a day-to-day basis are insane. Sometimes you get super healthy food in a plastic container, or you are chewing a gum that has canola oil, or you're buying this, hipster-looking sparkling water that you think it's kind of healthy, but it's not. It's owned by Coca-Cola and it has massive toxicity levels. It's, it's complex.
Yeah, I don't think people are aware of it because they don't sit there and read nutrition labels. We also forget how much processed products we used to consume. Where obviously, if you come from a little bit more of an immigrant background, where your parents or your grandparents, they cooked everything from scratch, right? That's the interesting paradox too, right? You go travel to places like Italy, they eat much more carbohydrates than we do. A lot of breads and pastas, but everything is fresh ingredients from scratch. They don't put additives in it. And a lot of people, I've heard this so many times, they're like, I spent months or a year in Italy. I ate, very flexibly, and I lost weight. And I think it's a combination of the less processed foods, less endocrine disrupting chemicals, and more walking in terms of physical activity that actually keeps people a lot fitter than they are in the U.S. So that was a huge phenomenon, but I didn't realize how much of you see the obesity, right, in the U.S., especially if you get outside the coast. So you go to Middle America, where I did my fellowship in Illinois. You go to an average Walmart there, the skinny person is in the minority right now. But the hormones you don't see, right? There's not an external manifestation of it. But that trend was very alarming to me, which I was like, wow, that's a huge decrease biologically. The interesting thing, psychologically, you see that as well. If you ask guys over the age of 65, 82% of them consider themselves highly masculine. If you ask men under 30, only 49% consider themselves highly masculine. It's the first time in American history that the majority of young men do not consider themselves highly masculine. Now, is that because their testosterone levels are way, way lower? Probably. But I also think it's not cool to be masculine anymore, right? If you look at even the movies in the 80s and 90s, the hyper-masculine action hero, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, that was the ideal. Now it's kind of this Ryan Gosling metrosexual kind of, let me sing a musical, kind of thing. And that's
there's we have The Rock still, maybe. But
you still, it's not a complete emasculation, I would say, but it's definitely more diversity. And then there's the social phenomenon, right? In terms of this whole phenomenon of toxic masculinity, the American Psychological Association saying traditionally masculine traits like competitiveness, stoicism, aggression are harmful. And they're actually arguing scientifically, although I think it's very questionable science, that that's true. I think it's making it, quite frankly, unpopular to be masculine. They're telling young men don't be masculine, don't follow these sort of masculine virtues anymore. Which I thought was very unscientific, and also to your point, just like Expensify, very biased. Like the American Psychological Association, that to me was a very political point of view. It's not a scientific point of view, and it's not the consensus either. By the way, there's a handful of psychologists as part of one division of the APA that kind of blew that up in the media, just like the Gillette ad about toxic masculinity. And so I was kind of watching this, and like I said, I'm a clinician scientist. I'm not a politician. I don't really care that much about politics. I care about helping people. But I was seeing this happen, And I was like, this is a disaster for society, right? Men are literally weaker. It's not even just their testosterone. Literally, their grip strength has gone down in the last few decades. Their hormone profile is ruined. Everyone's getting fatter. Everyone's getting diabetes. Everyone is not feeling like themselves anymore, right, in terms of their masculinity. And they're being told they're toxic, and that these traits, which are good for society, by the way, I think it's good to be competitive. It's good to be aggressive. It's good to be so if it's channeled in a way that's positive, pro-social, and productive. And I think that's actually the hallmark of a mature masculinity is men are driven to dominate, in fact. Like, that's how you get ahead. Because if you look at the historical precedent, most men did not reproduce. You had to be better than average in order to have a mate. Now, with the advent of sort of advanced civilization society, I think we made a social compromise in saying, like, yes, one person for every partner, we're going to enforce sort of and reinforce monogamy. That sort of changed over time. I think men are essentially much worse off than they were in previous decades, despite the fact that socioeconomically there's way more opportunity and longevity than there was because of medical advances. And so I was basically disturbed by all this phenomenon, and I was like, what can we do to ameliorate this on a biological, on a psychological, and social level? And that really became the impetus for me to be like, you know what? I really care about this because I think there's tremendous harm that's being done, and there's no one addressing this, I think, in a way that's effective. So I'm going to reluctantly dust off my entrepreneur shoes and go back out there and address this with Maximus. And so that's how I ended up starting it, out of that experience.
Incredible. As you were talking, I was just thinking, I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen when we have kids? How are we going to raise them in the correct way? I think a lot about that. The more comfortable I've been getting at some point, towards becoming a father. And the solution I've got was like, oh yeah, we should all get a citadel and educate our children there, and then do the Amish way, but with a little more rock and roll, I guess.
It's actually, it's not a bad idea. I always say it takes a village to raise a child. That expression is actually true because the interesting thing is there's clear actually data that fathers do play an important role in society. Fatherless children who are raised without fathers do worse, right, in terms of their psychological outcomes, crime, all kinds of negative outcomes. I think that's absolutely unequivocal, and we should promote fatherhood. The problem, though, is even a lot of fathers are gone. They're kind of because of single-family households, and then two, you do even get a phenomenon where even if he did have a dad, he may not have been sort of either physically or emotionally available for a multitude of reasons, and did not provide you the mentorship or guidance that you needed. I think in more traditional culture and societies, that risk was attenuated because of the focus on extended family. So you had an older brother. First of all, families were bigger, right? You had multiple siblings, and so you might have had a significantly older brother that played a father figure, even if your dad was like always away at work and not kind of providing that. You had a lot of cousins that also similarly can provide that. You had uncles, and you also had members of the community. You had neighbors that were much more actively involved versus this sort of strangers in suburbia phenomenon that we have sort of now. And I think it actually helped because even if your dad was a good person, he's only one person. You're fallible as a human being and as a man, and you can only maybe you show one aspect. Maybe you're a great professional role model and you can teach them everything there is to know about finance. But maybe you don't know shit about, I don't know, dating, or you married your high school sweetheart, and I don't know, you just can't provide a really great relationship advice. And they need an older brother maybe for that, or a cousin that can provide that. And so it really helps balance out, and I think also reduce, quite frankly, pathology, because when you have multiple role models, I think it provides, it teaches basically a young man or a young boy that take what's useful and leave the rest. Versus when you have one template or no template as a role model, well, you're either going to adopt a very flawed way of being a man, or you don't really have one at all. And so my personal philosophy, by the way, is that you should have multiple role models. Ideally, you do have a father figure if you do, and you're blessed and lucky enough to have that. I do think it's important to have it from extended family, like I said, brothers, cousins, uncles, etc. I think it's important to have it from a little bit more of a professional role model And ideally, that's a teacher, a coach, or a psychologist. I think those are very helpful in having like a non-family member who is kind of pushing you and helping you and has a little bit more objectivity. I think it's actually quite natural for people to have kind of aspirational role models. So this is often an athlete or celebrity, right? Boys, like growing up, they had, Messi or Ronaldo or someone poster on their wall, because it's like they had the virtues or qualities that they wanted to become when they grew up. And then I even think the last kind of tier of role model is the historical role model. It doesn't even have to be a living person. It can be a historical figure that you admire. It could even be a fictional character, right? Like it could be a superhero because, Batman overcame his fear and anxiety of bats and almost owned it and became, the Batman. And there's actually a brilliant psychological lesson in terms of approaching your fear versus avoiding it. And you can use that as a template for obviously how to live your life. And so I argue that the new model is, as opposed to like the concentric circles of family and village, which unfortunately is gone in a hyper-individualistic American society, we can sort of do it in this hierarchical way where you find different role models and different tiers that can provide templates of manhood and fatherhood. And that's part of what we do. And we started out, before we sort of launched, by just trying to provide that almost like community as a service, if you will, right? So first of all, we started a hashtag called Tonic Masculinity as the antidote to toxic masculinity. And if you go on Twitter, you type in hashtag Tonic Masculinity, tonic being healing. It's literally examples of good role models as men. It's like men, guys, Kobe Bryant being a good girl dad, men using their courage and aggression to go rescue animals and babies from, burning fires. All these kind of positive examples of what a mature masculinity looks like. Because I think that's unfortunately missing in society. And I think that's in fact why the Joe Rogans and Jordan Petersons and David Goggins and Jocko Willinicks of the world are so popular, because they're playing these surrogate, essentially father, brother, uncle figures for people who don't have them. I think that's incredibly useful, and that's kind of part of what we're doing at Maximus. The other part of it is literally providing people with a virtual tribe. So again, before we launched, we started a Discord server, and there's literally over 1,000 men on there. And the whole concept is around mutual improvement. So as opposed to self-improvement in American society, it's always an individualistic thing. You go work on yourself, you read your self-help books, you go work one-on-one in isolation, nobody knows about it. I don't really think that's the way that it's traditionally been done, nor is it the best way to do it. As I mentioned, the group therapy and stuff is actually tremendously beneficial. So we're adopting that and saying whatever it is that you're working on, your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your focus, your relationships and intimacy, you can do it in the context of other people. Because, you may be a 22-year-old college student, but we have a 45-year-old hedge fund manager in New York who has 3 kids, and he can provide you with mentorship. And he may benefit as well because he feels like he's giving back. And so it's this mutually beneficial thing to work on mutual improvement. And we've seen a lot of positive feedback around that because unfortunately, especially during the quarantine, people are so isolated and so not only in need of social connection, but really in need of wisdom and guidance. And I think that's really the thing that's missing in modern society. And that's a big kind of impetus in terms of doing what we do.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this hole now, it's getting fueled by a bunch of these incredible communities that add value, primarily also because, any church, they just kind of suck for the most part. Aside from like maybe some like tiny, experimental little congregations that are very, very small, but in general, as they scale, they inevitably become political organizations, right? A lot of what you're talking about will come from some sort of organized, ritualistic development that we would give meaning to our lives with a combination of self-respect and the ability to learn from each other. And, but ultimately, I mean, I'll tell you something you don't know. So I actually kicked my father out of my house when I was 17 because he cheated on my mom with multiple different women, and I was an only child. So I think I became a nerd because I found the mentorship and father figures aside from my grandpa and my mom. To a certain extent in all these books. So I was just learning from a bunch of dead people that were very beneficial to me in that sense. So deeply connect with that mission, So ultimately, what is the Maximus protocol, basically. So if you want to become a customer or learn more about it, aside from the holistic community aspect of it, what else are you guys working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So now that we're kind of coming out of stealth, I'm really excited to share kind of the product that we're actually bringing to the world. Maximus is a consumer telemedicine company that provides hormone and health behavior optimization. So what we provide is a program or a protocol that optimizes testosterone. So as I mentioned, not only is there a huge declining level of testosterone, but also there's this movement around health and performance optimization, right? Some people call it kind of biohacking, for instance, that comes from like companies like Bulletproof, which is maybe there's something wrong with your testosterone, but maybe you want to be better than average. Maybe you want to, just like an athlete, achieve your maximum sort of potential. And so what we provide is a protocol that includes prescription medications, supplements, and health behavior coaching. So I'll talk about how each of those work in turn. So like a telemedicine company, what we provide is actually at-home lab testing, which we've validated. So we can actually measure your hormones at home through a finger prick or even a saliva test now. That's very accurate compared to the gold standard of going to a Quest or a LabCorp. So this is actually a fundamentally revolutionary transformation in terms of, at least when it comes to the simple markers, we can actually, with a great degree of reliability and validity, measure in the comfort and convenience of your own home so you don't have to go to a lab. So what we do is we mail people these lab tests, and then we know what your baseline levels are. And we have you fill out sort of an intake questionnaire where you talk about, how you feel, any potential symptoms that you have, or what are your goals? Like, what you want to improve your energy levels, you want to improve your drive, you want to improve your confidence, maybe do a little bit of body recomposition, improving your muscle mass, or dropping your belly fat. And so if you have those goals, the doctor will kind of assess if it's right for you, and there's no sort of exclusion criteria, and then mail a combination of medication and supplements. What's really revolutionary about what we're doing, though, is it's not TRT. So a lot of people may have heard of testosterone replacement therapy. Traditionally, if you have low testosterone, they give you injectable testosterone. It's a pain in the butt because that's where you have to inject it every single week. It does work in terms of increasing testosterone, but it comes at a pretty drastic cost. The body's intelligent. When you inject synthetic testosterone from outside your body's like, I'm getting enough. I don't need to make any more. And so literally, your testes, where the word testosterone comes from, they shrink and atrophy, they shut down, they stop producing their own testosterone, which makes you infertile. So that's why young men, generally, and healthy men, generally don't do TRT, because it really essentially shuts you down. It almost makes you like the equivalent of a type 1 diabetic who's dependent on insulin. So you kind of make a decision to go on TRT for the rest of your life. That's why guys like Joe Rogan, who didn't really start doing it until their 40s, they're done having children, and I'm going to basically be using this till I die, kind of make that decision. But I think it's never going to be a mainstream thing because of the adverse effects are pretty drastic. What we're doing is totally different.
Yeah. And painful as well. I've never tried it, but my understanding is that it burns. It's just not a very pleasant thing to get testosterone injected in your butt.
Nobody likes injecting, right? I've done so much blood testing just out of curiosity. I don't mind it at all, but it's not fun. I don't like going and getting it, an injection. If I could avoid it and there's an alternative, I would 100% do it. And that's what we're doing. It's an oral medication. It's a pill, just like you take any other pill or supplement. So the form factor is 10x better, obviously. But here's the other thing that's tremendously better is it actually stimulates your body's own natural production of testosterone. So instead of shutting off the testes, it actually sends a signal to be produce more luteinizing hormone, which in turn produces more testosterone. So you're actually continuing to produce more of your own testosterone. Actually makes your testicles bigger, and it actually increases fertility. So it actually increases sperm count because it was originally a fertility drug. And so it actually works just as well as TRT, but it doesn't have all those negative adverse effects. In fact, it has some benefits because it works almost in the opposite manner. And so I think it's literally a 10x better product experience. And we've been doing an alpha pilot, closed pilot, and I'm actually really excited to talk publicly for the first time on video about the results debut on your podcast, especially. With our first cohort of patients, we're seeing a 1.9x increase in total testosterone, 2.2x increase in free testosterone, which is dramatic. And so basically you're seeing a doubling of testosterone levels. which is just as good, if not significantly, in fact, better than TRT. But you're doing it in a way that maintains your testicles, maintains your fertility, and it's just a simple couple pills that you take before you go to bed at night. So tremendously beneficial and tremendously effective, and we're obviously really excited about it. So the last part of it that I should mention, though, it is a program and protocol. So in addition to the medications and supplements that we provide, we are doing this health behavior coaching. So we put people into small online groups, very similar to Amada from the lessons learned there, and we help people with the other elements that are really important for hormones and also holistic health. So we help people optimize their diet, their exercise, their sleep, their focus, and their relationships, as we mentioned. And they're setting their goals, they're improving. And so when they're seeing a doubling of their testosterone levels, it's because of both the medication, it's because of the supplement that helps rid the body of those excess estrogens that come from those endocrine disrupting chemicals. And it's also because a lot of times they're improving their sleep. I think everyone has messed up sleep, unfortunately, these days. It's so common. And so helping people get an extra hour or so of sleep improves not only their hormone profile, but their mood, their functioning, their focus, all around the board. So we really try to be holistic in terms of our approach. And that's what makes it the Maximus program, Maximus protocol, because it's a multi-component, multifactorial treatment. And I think that's the only really ethical way to practice, whether it's psychology or medicine, is you got to provide people with, a combination that really helps support their overall health and their overall mission in life.
That's great. Is there a way for folks to then they get to a point where they get off of it, but they continue on the softer side, or is it like you said with TRT? At some point when you start, you have to stay on it forever.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Because,
so there's no dependency.
Basically,
Yeah, there's no dependency like there is with TRT, where if you stop TRT, you're going to feel terrible because your body's shut down. It's basically like if you haven't driven a car in a few months, the car battery's dead. It's not going to turn on. Same thing. Your testicles are literally shut off, and they're not going to produce very much. With our protocol, it's the opposite. You can basically discontinue anytime without a lot of problems. Your testosterone is just going to go from the 2x levels back down to the 1x normal level that you were at before. So you can make that decision, obviously, to do it anytime. But if you're getting benefit, you can basically take it indefinitely. It's actually been studied in healthy men, in young men, for at least 5 years without significant adverse effects. And in fact, in the original clinical trials, all medications, by the way, have side effects, but the side effects were actually minimal, and they're actually no different than placebo. And so compared to the relative spectrum of drugs, they're, relatively less side effects. So in our experience, most folks, if they find an initial benefit, like their numbers are going up, they're feeling better in terms of their energy levels and their mood, you can kind of take it as long as you'd like to.
Wonderful. And what's next for the company when you suspect that this will be publicly available, and what are the plans for?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we are available in California and Florida. We just finished up this pilot, as I mentioned, and the results, like I said, were incredible. In fact, I gave like a sneak preview of the results on Twitter with the first handful of patients, and people just went nuts. Like people were DMing me, and they were like, "How do I get on this? Like this is incredible." And so we've had just amazing kind of feedback. So we've been kind of throttling kind of people through. If it's kind of people, been DMing me on social media, I've kind of been letting them in kind of one by one. But we're going to start to open up the floodgates a little bit more. So you can go to maximustribe.com. That's our main domain. We're going to have the website up in the next couple of weeks. But right now it's just a landing page with your email. Or you can just DM me on social media if you want to kind of cut the line. If you go on Twitter, I'm at Dr. Sepah, DrSepah. We'll get you in. If you're listening to this podcast more than a few weeks from now, the public website will be launched, and you can just go through and enroll sort of directly. And then we'll be expanding, obviously, in more states thereafter. So
Perfect.
We'll be hopefully in most places in the country.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say it will be published probably by the time that this is published. We will your website will be live. So you already said what I was going to say. It's perfect. Awesome. Well, I guess just to finish, we always like to just end up with some rapid fire questions, and one of them would be what's like the ideal morning routine for you? It's like a perfect morning routine when you do it exactly how you want it. How does that work?
Yeah, I don't think I'm as maybe Tim Ferriss-ized as some folks, but I will tell you, because sleep optimization is part of the Maximus protocol. I actually have a whole sleep optimization brand. You can check it out on Twitter. Some things that I think are particularly important is it is useful to have stability in terms of your sleep. So one thing I look at is the variance in terms of your bedtime and your wake-up time. And the more you can reduce the variance, better. Because it essentially trains your body into thinking, 10 o'clock is when I go to sleep, 6 a.m. is when I wake up, and you're more likely to fall asleep very quickly in terms of your sleep latency, and you're going to have less trouble getting up because your body will naturally sort of wake up. So that's rule number one, is try to reduce the variability in terms of the time that you go to sleep and wake up so that your body has this natural sort of rhythm. Tip number two, I would say, is never use a alarm clock to wake up. This is kind of a non-standard contrarian kind of point of view, but my belief is if you're waking up with an alarm clock, you are by definition sleep deprived because your body obviously wanted to sleep more and you're interrupting it, right? So the solution is you need to go to bed earlier so that you can wake up before the time that you need to wake up. And that obviously requires discipline and going to bed earlier, which, in this digital age is hard for people to do. But it's absolutely necessary if you're trying to get optimal health. You don't wake up with an alarm clock. I do set one, but it's really as a backup, which is it just gives me lowers my anxiety that I'm not going to miss a random morning meeting. Although I wake up usually a few hours before my first meeting, but just in case, I think it's really for peace of mind more than anything. So number two, never wake up with an alarm clock. Number three, get out of bed as quickly as possible, I would say. So one of the measures that we look at as a psychologist is sleep efficiency, which is the percentage of time that you actually sleep in bed. Ideally, you want that to be above 80, 90, ideally even 95%, so that you're falling asleep within the first 5 to 15 minutes, and then right when you get up, get the heck out of bed. Absolutely do not snooze. Snoozing is the worst possible thing. It's better for you to just sleep in and force yourself to get out of bed rather than constantly drift in and out of sleep, because it's not deep, it's not restorative, it's not helpful sleep. So get out of bed as soon as possible. And then fourth, highly, highly important in terms of regulating and setting your circadian rhythm, is I try to go outside, take a 10-minute walk in bright sunshine, get sunshine on my skin and my face, and that helps set your circadian rhythm, helps you fall asleep better later on during the day. It also improves just kind of your mood and focus, right? When you don't go outside and you're kind of inside, the transition from sort of sleep to wake is kind of gradual. But when you go and get bright sunshine, even if it's sticking your head out of the window, ideally you can actually go outside where you live. It just really wakes you up and gets you sort of going. I do that. I make a little breakfast shake. I do try to get 20 grams of protein. I think that's also very important. I know intermittent fasting is really popular right now. My philosophy is just stop eating after dinner. That's how you start your fast. But if you think about what the word breakfast means, it's the breaking of the fast, breakfast. And your body is essentially undergoing a catabolic process when you're sleeping. And so if you're more oriented towards bodybuilding, hypertrophy like I am, I'm trying to maximize my muscle, in my youth, you're kind of breaking down as you're sleeping. So I try to get protein immediately when I wake up in order to stop the catabolism or the muscle breakdown that's happening and induce muscle protein synthesis basically as soon as I start my day. And also that just kind of gives me my body a little extra energy to work and be productive in that morning until I go and have a proper lunch, proper meal. So that's kind of my simple morning routine. I don't do any crazy extra exercises and stuff other than I would say actually during the morning the morning walk where I get my sunshine, I actually do a little bit of open awareness mindfulness. So I kind of kill two birds with one stone in doing kind of a walking meditation, if you will. I think that's helpful to just kind of clear the mind a little bit and prepare it for going to war at work. And I find that it's a pretty simple morning routine, maybe not as extensive as other people, but I always say, look, the best habit is the one that you are willing to do and stick with forever. And so that works for me. I can be pretty consistent about it versus doing a crazy amount of sitting down meditation, breath work. I don't know what Wim Hof ice bath things that people do. I think they're great, but I think you should do them if you're willing to do them and do them consistently. I find a lot of people do that stuff for a few weeks, few months, and they stop because it becomes inconvenient, they travel, they lose their routine, whatever. So if you can do it, I would say great, go nuts and do way more than I do. I find keeping it simple is the best thing for me because I can do it consistently, and I think consistency is king.
Wonderful. Cam, thank you. We really appreciate your time. It was wonderful catching up and seeing you. It's been a while since I've been to LA. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for investing in Maximus, your support of confidence there, both financially and obviously in terms of the support as an investor. And thank you so much for doing what you're doing in terms of your podcast and the mission of your, new organization. I think it's so important in this day and age to have supporters and allies and people who are aligned in terms of, your mission. I'm obviously very much aligned. And that's why I'm really, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to work with you. And I think you're doing great things. So I'm happy to continue to have these conversations going forward.
Thank you so much. And, for all of those listening, please, we're available on every single platform. It's not hard to find the Inevitable podcast. And, please like, subscribe, and that whole thing that people always say. It does make a difference now that I've been producing content. So I understand why everyone asks for it. But, all right. Until the next episode.